Elijah Brooks was used to being overlooked, but that all changed the moment his fingers hit the piano keys. It wasn't that Elijah was shy, he just didn't see the point in speaking when no one was really listening. Growing up on the west side of Baton Rouge, he didn't have much. His world was a cramped two-bedroom apartment on Florida Boulevard, where the walls were thin and the noise from the neighbors never seemed to stop. His mom, Charlene, worked double shifts at a local clinic, and his older brother, Isaiah, spent most of his time with a crowd Elijah didn't trust. But Elijah had music. Not a fancy piano or high-end equipment, just an old, battered keyboard at the local rec center. Half the keys were broken, and if you moved the chord the wrong way, it sparked. But to Elijah, it was enough. Every afternoon after school, he'd rush there, fingers itching to play. No sheet music, no lessons, just the sounds he carried in his head and heart. He played what he felt, sometimes joy, sometimes anger, sometimes silence. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he wasn't the star student either. Teachers often missed the way he tapped rhythms with his pencil during math, or the way his eyes would light up when the school anthem played. Most of the kids didn't notice him, except when they needed someone to borrow answers from or pick on. His real escape came from Miss Delacroix, his music teacher. She saw him for more than just the quiet kid in class. She noticed how his hands seemed to speak when words couldn't. She'd pull him aside after class, ask him about chords, scales, how to tell a story with his hands instead of his mouth. "You hear the world differently than most people, Elijah," she told him once after he improvised a lullaby for a class assignment. "Don't ever let that go." He didn't plan to. Then, one Thursday morning before spring break, the school announced an event with Bayside Prep, an elite private school across town. The announcement was framed as a community arts exchange, where Elijah's class would spend a day attending workshops and watching performances at Bayside. Most kids groaned, but Elijah sat up straight. He'd heard of Bayside Prep, big lawns, uniforms, sushi in the cafeteria. Rumor had it their music department had a baby grand in every room. Elijah had never even touched a real piano, though he had seen one once at the concert hall when his class got free tickets to the Philharmonic. It gleamed under the stage lights like something out of a dream. He didn't hear much of the concert that night. He was too busy watching the pianist's hands. Now he had a chance to see it for himself, maybe even play one if no one was looking. The night before the trip, Charlene ironed Elijah's best shirt, even though it had a small stain near the cuff. "You behave," she said, not looking up. "Don't embarrass me in front of those people." "I won't," he promised. "Don't touch anything you're not supposed to," she added. He nodded, but music had a way of making him forget the rules. The bus ride to Bayside felt like entering another world. As they passed through the iron gates, Elijah stared out the window at rows of perfectly trimmed hedges, fountains that actually worked, and buildings that looked more like museums than classrooms. Kids in matching navy blazers laughed in groups, carefree, as if they didn't have to think about tomorrow. Everything seemed too clean, too still. Even the sidewalks felt expensive. Elijah followed his classmates off the bus, gripping the strap of his backpack, absorbing the sight of a courtyard with a bronze statue in the center, some founder with a scroll in one hand and a smug grin on his face. Inside, the floor shone like glass. The air smelled like lemon polish and fresh paper. No graffiti, no cracked tiles, no teachers shouting from down the hall. Just quiet confidence. Elijah walked past displays of student art framed like it belonged in a gallery. One piece even had a price tag, $200. Elijah stared. He could draw too, but no one had ever offered to buy his sketches. They were herded into the auditorium, where Bayside students were already seated in neat rows. An older man with silver hair welcomed them with the voice people use at church, saying something about unity and creative expression. "This is a celebration of talent from all backgrounds," he said. Elijah looked around. Of the hundreds of students, he was one of maybe 5 black kids. Most of the Bayside students looked like they'd never missed a meal, never been told, "Not today." But Elijah wasn't going to let any of that stop him. That day, in front of all those people, something inside him was going to change forever. Elijah Brooks had always been told not to touch things that didn't belong to him, but when he sat down at that gleaming piano, everything changed. It wasn't that Elijah didn't know his worth. He did. But here, at Bayside Prep, surrounded by polished kids in tailored blazers and wealth that practically radiated off the walls, proving himself felt like an impossible task. It wasn't a matter of skill, it was about being seen, and Elijah knew that no one here would believe in him unless he showed them. The day began with a performance by the Bayside Jazz Ensemble. They were good, clean, practiced, and even impressive. But Elijah felt something tighten in his chest as he listened, not because he wasn't good enough, but because he knew that his music had something deeper, and no one would see that unless he proved it. When they split into breakout sessions, Elijah found himself in a songwriting workshop. The room, 208, was filled with kids who talked about things he couldn't relate to: cafeteria food, Teslas, the latest brand name trends. He kept quiet, observing them while his thoughts wandered back to his own world. But then his eyes landed on it: the piano. It was a Steinway Grand, black and polished, bigger than any instrument Elijah had ever touched. The keys gleamed, almost daring him to play, as though the piano knew what was about to happen. He couldn't take his eyes off it. Before he could move, a voice broke through his focus. "Don't even think about it." Elijah turned. A tall boy with slicked-back blonde hair stood behind him, flanked by two others who looked like they spent more time practicing scowls than music. The boy wore a monogrammed blazer with PJW stitched on it. "That's my dad's donation," he sneered, looking Elijah up and down. "You got anything like that in your neighborhood?" Elijah blinked, unsure if the kid was trying to get a rise out of him or just being cruel. "I wasn't going to break it," he replied quietly. "You sure about that?" The boy smirked. "Careful, those keys aren't made for dirty fingers." The words hit like a slap. The room went quieter. Elijah felt heat rise to his ears, but he didn't move. He kept his hands at his sides. The piano suddenly felt miles away, like it was in another dimension. Part of him wanted to walk away, but another part, something deeper, wanted to speak up. Yet he didn't trust his voice to come out steady. And then he heard it, a laugh from behind him. That laugh changed everything. Without even thinking, Elijah turned. 1 second he was frozen, heart pounding, and the next he was walking toward the piano. The smirk on the tall boy's face faltered just slightly, and his friends exchanged surprised glances. Elijah didn't flinch. He pulled the bench out with both hands, sat down slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. His palms were damp, his throat dry, but his fingers didn't shake. The room was still, not silent, but still, like everyone was holding their breath. The instructor hadn't arrived yet, and maybe that was a blessing. Maybe it was fate. Elijah raised his hands above the keys, then hesitated. This wasn't the broken keyboard at the rec center. This was real. This was weight. This was sound that carried, that filled the room, not because it was loud, but because it had presence. He could feel every eye on him, and Preston's voice echoed in his head. Dirty fingers. But he took a deep breath, and with a single press of his finger, he hit a simple C, soft, clean. It rang out like it had been waiting for him. Then came the E, then the G, and before he knew it, he was building the chord, just like he always did, by feel. No one had taught him how, but he didn't need teaching. Music was the one thing that made sense without explanation. His left hand followed with a gentle bass line at first, then stronger, and his right hand wove a melody over the rhythm, a tune that had always been with him, one he had never named because it was too personal, a song that didn't need words to express what he couldn't say. The room began to shift. Conversation slowed. Chairs creaked as people leaned in. The two boys behind Preston no longer looked amused, they were confused. Preston didn't speak, but his mouth tightened, and Elijah didn't even notice anymore. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for the nights when he sat alone in his room, listening to the sounds of the city outside his window. He was playing for the Sundays when his mother swayed to gospel at church, her eyes closed, her face soft for once. He was playing for the version of himself that had never been told, "Don't touch that." The music swelled. His hands moved faster now, more confident, sharper. It wasn't perfect. He missed a note, stumbled on a chord, but it didn't matter. It was raw, alive. the kind of playing that didn't ask permission. When he finished, the room was still. There was a pause, one of those moments that comes after something powerful, something real. Then a girl near the back let out a soft, "Whoa!" Another student clapped. A few others joined in, and Preston didn't move. His hands were clenched at his sides. "That wasn't bad," one of his friends muttered. But to Elijah, that didn't matter. Elijah's hands were still slightly trembling as he stood backstage, staring at the polished stage floor in front of him. The room beyond the curtain was a blur of noise and movement, students chatting, teachers murmuring, and phones flickering. It all seemed so casual, but to Elijah it felt like everything was different. It wasn't just the spotlight, it was the weight of being seen, of being heard. But it wasn't about the crowd. For the first time, Elijah was going to play for himself. He didn't know how it would go, but he knew he couldn't walk away now. Back in the hallway, after his moment at the piano, everything had shifted. Elijah had stepped out into the hall to find a small crowd gathered. Students, a few teachers, drawn by the sound of his music. Some looked curious, others surprised, but it was the one face that caught his attention. Miss Delacroix, his music teacher. She was standing near the back, her hand covering her mouth. Not in shock, but in something softer, something proud. Her eyes shone in a way that made Elijah look down, feeling the weight of her gaze, but also the warmth. She approached him slowly. "You really played that?" she asked gently. Elijah nodded, almost afraid to speak the truth out loud. "That was yours? That music?" He nodded again. His throat felt dry, but the words wouldn't come. He hadn't even planned to play, hadn't known if he could, but now everything was different, and Miss Delacroix's voice softened even more. "Elijah, that wasn't just good. That was something people remember." Before he could respond, another teacher, a tall woman in a gray blazer, approached him. She bent slightly to meet him at eye level, clipboard tucked under her arm. "I'm Mrs. Coldwell," she said. "I run the advanced music program here. I heard you from down the hall." Elijah was caught off guard. I just practice," he mumbled. "I play at the rec center sometimes. And at home, when my brother lets me use his headphones." Mrs. Coldwell smiled. "Well, you've got something special. That kind of ear, that kind of expression. You don't teach that. You guide it. You nurture it." Behind her, Preston, the boy who had made those cruel comments earlier, emerged from the music room. His blazer was crumpled from leaning against the wall too long. His eyes met Elijah's, and for a second, Elijah thought he might say something, maybe even apologize. But instead, Preston just shrugged, and his friends laughed softly. Elijah didn't flinch. He had moved past that. Then Miss Delacroix asked him, "How would you feel about playing something at the final performance this afternoon?" Elijah looked up, his heart racing. "Me? Yes. There's always space for one guest student to share something at the closing. I know, you should do it." Elijah stared at the floor, his mind racing. Playing in a classroom was one thing, but in front of the whole auditorium, that was different. A wave of nerves hit him hard, like a second punch, but Miss Delacroix's voice was calm and steady. "You don't have to, Elijah, but I think you'll regret it if you don't." She was right. He nodded slowly, the decision settling in his chest like something solid. He couldn't back out now. The teachers began to scatter, the moment fading back into the hum of the day. Elijah followed Miss Delacroix as she led him toward the performance hall. The hallway seemed impossibly long, but something inside him had changed. It wasn't confidence, it was closer to certainty, like hearing a song for the first time and knowing exactly where the notes go, even if you've never heard it before. As he reached the doorway to the auditorium, he saw Preston standing off to the side, alone. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe to take back the cruel words, maybe to act like nothing had happened. But he just gave Elijah the smallest shrug before turning away. Elijah walked in, heart pounding. The auditorium was brighter than he remembered, rows of chairs stretching out before him, already half filled. Students shuffled in, laughing, scrolling on their phones, their voices casual. Teachers stood near the back, chatting. Everything felt so normal, except for Elijah. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt from that morning, sweat starting to darken the collar. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of playing, but from the weight of being seen. The unfamiliar eyes that were now focused on him, the pressure of the crowd. Miss Delacroix appeared beside him, her voice low. "They're going to love you." "What if I mess up?" Elijah asked, his voice almost a whisper. "You won't," she said confidently. "And even if you do, they'll still feel it." That helped a little. A student announcer, a tall girl with thick glasses and a polished voice, stepped up to the microphone. "We'd like to welcome a guest student from Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, Elijah Brooks, with an original piano piece." Polite applause filled the room. Elijah stepped out. Elijah didn't look at the crowd. He just focused on the piano, waiting at center stage. It gleamed under the lights, just like it had earlier, almost as if it knew him now. He sat down, took one breath, and let his fingers find their place. This time it wasn't the same melody as before. This one was slower, quieter, more patient, like a letter written out loud. It began with an ache, the kind you can't name, something in the pauses between notes, the way certain chords lingered longer than they should. Then it shifted, grew warmer, braver, like something fighting to stand on its own feet. Every measure spoke a piece of him. The nights alone in his room, the sound of his mother praying in the kitchen when she thought he was asleep, the way the rec center's keyboard sparked but never stopped working. The room stilled. Even the faculty stopped whispering. Phones lowered, eyes lifted. Somewhere in the second half, the emotion behind the notes caught up to him. His chest clenched, his eyes stung, but his hands didn't falter. He played all the way through. When the last note faded, he lifted his hands slowly, like releasing something heavy. Silence followed, then a single clap, then another, and soon the whole room erupted in applause. No standing ovation, no dramatic movie moment, but it was real, full. Some students stood. One teacher wiped her eye. Even the announcer looked surprised. Elijah stood, bowed without thinking, then walked off stage fast before the crowd could catch him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing hard. That's when he heard the voice. That was incredible. He turned. It was Preston. His blazer was buttoned now, hair a little neater, but the cockiness was gone. He wasn't flanked by friends this time. "I didn't know you could do all that," Preston said. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. Preston shifted uncomfortably. "What I said earlier, I was out of line." Still, Elijah didn't speak. "I guess I just didn't expect it," Preston added. Elijah looked at him, then said quietly, "You didn't have to." Preston nodded once. "Yeah, that was it. No big moment, no handshake. Just an awkward pause between two boys standing in a hallway too big for either of them." Miss Delacroix came out smiling. "You did it!" Elijah managed a breathless laugh. "I think I did." She looked at him for a long second. "Let's talk later. There's someone I want you to meet." But what Elijah didn't know was that someone in the crowd had already made a call, one that would open a door he never imagined he could walk through. By the time the bus pulled back into the parking lot at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle, the sky was streaked with gold. Elijah sat near the back, his forehead resting against the window, watching Baton Rouge roll by in pieces. Fast food signs, gas stations, corner stores. Familiar again. Comfortable, but smaller now. He hadn't said much on the ride. Some classmates gave him high fives. A few asked how he learned to play like that. One boy, Jamari, even joked, "Bro, you made rich kids clap, that's magic." Elijah smiled, but inside everything still buzzed. Not nerves, not fear. Something else he didn't have a word for yet. Miss Delacroix waited at the bottom step as students climbed off the bus. "Elijah," she said, pulling him aside gently, "that woman I introduced you to, Mrs. Coldwell, she wants to see you again." He blinked. "Why?" "She runs a summer arts program, scholarship-based. It's rare to find someone like you who hasn't been formally trained." Elijah looked down at his sneakers. The left one was scuffed. I don't have money for lessons. That's the point, Miss Delacroix said. You wouldn't need any. Everything's covered. You just have to show up and play. Elijah didn't know what to say. Opportunities like that didn't come to kids like him, not without strings. I told her I'd talk to your mom, she added. She'll want to know. That night at home, Charlene stood in the kitchen, holding the brochure in one hand and a half-burnt grilled cheese in the other. Her face didn't say much, but her silence was loud. They're not trying to use him for anything? She finally asked. No, ma'am, Miss Delacroix said from the other side of the table. It's a real opportunity. They've done this for students across the state. Charlene looked over the paper again. And he'd stay where? In dorms? Supervised Baton Rouge School for the Arts, just a few weeks. He'd be home by the end of summer. Elijah sat on the edge of the couch, backpack still on, his fingers curled into the straps. His mother stared at him, not blinking. You want this? He met her eyes. I think I do. She sighed deep, the kind of sigh she only made when her mind was traveling way ahead of her mouth. He's 12, she said quietly. Still a baby. I'll be careful, Elijah whispered. You better. She looked at Miss Delacroix again. I'll think on it. That was more than enough for now. A week later, the letter came, a white envelope with blue trim. His name typed neatly in the center. Inside was the formal offer. Elijah read it 3 times before handing it to his mom. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded. Then she handed it back without a word. He packed his things in a duffel bag. It was bigger than Elijah ever imagined, but somehow it still felt right. Miss Delacroix drove him to the campus herself, and as they made their way there, she spoke about the other kids who had gone through the program, some who had never even touched a real instrument before their first lesson, and others who had gone on to places like Juilliard and Berkeley, but none of them sounded like you, she said, and Elijah knew she meant it. The campus wasn't shiny or fancy, not like Bayside, but it felt honest. The music building had paint chips on the windowsills, and the benches were worn smooth from years of students waiting. Elijah liked that. On his first day, he played in front of 3 instructors. They didn't ask where he came from. They asked what key he felt most at home in. D minor, he said. They nodded like they understood. By the end of the first week, Elijah had written 3 new pieces. By the second week, he was teaching a classmate how to move through changes with feel instead of math. One evening after dinner, his instructor sat beside him in the practice room. You know what I told my husband after I heard you play? She asked. Elijah shook his head. That's what talent looks like when it's unafraid. But even with new keys in his hands and doors swinging open, Elijah still had one more thing to do before any of it felt real. It was October when Elijah walked back through the doors of Bayside Prep. This time, he didn't arrive on a school bus with matching t-shirts and a field trip form in his backpack. He came alone, invited by Mrs. Coldwell to perform at the annual fall recital. It was her idea, a surprise solo act from a student of the summer arts program, a way to show what raw talent could become with the right support. Elijah had grown a little taller since spring. His jeans fit better, his curls were neater, and his hands had developed a quiet confidence. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. The auditorium looked just as he remembered it. Clean floors, bright lights, that stage. It didn't feel bigger than him anymore. In the front row sat Miss Delacroix, her purse balanced on her lap, eyes shining with quiet pride. And next to her, Charlene, wearing her best blouse and clutching the edge of her seat like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She hadn't been sure about the performance at first. I don't know what people like that want from kids like you, she had said. Elijah had answered simply, just to hear. Now here she was, waiting to hear. The MC gave a brief introduction. Tonight's final performer is a young man who reminds us why music still matters. Please welcome Elijah Brooks. He walked out, not too fast, not too slow, just steady. The Steinway was there again, waiting. This time, he didn't hesitate. The piece he played was new, something he'd written 2 weeks earlier, inspired by his summer. It had no title, just movement. It started low, steady, like steps being counted, then climbed measure by measure into something warmer, more certain. There were flourishes, yes, but nothing showy. Everything had purpose. Notes flowed like thoughts forming mid-sentence, honest, true. Halfway through, he glanced up. Preston sat 3 rows back, arms folded, watching. They hadn't spoken since that hallway, but Elijah didn't need words. The silence between them now wasn't heavy. It was filled with understanding. When the final note hung in the air, Elijah held it just long enough for the breath in the room to catch. Then he lifted his hands. And this time the applause came fast. Real, not polite, not hesitant. Some students stood. Charlene stood too, but she didn't clap at first. She just stared at her son, like she couldn't believe he was hers. Then, quietly, she smiled. After the show, people approached him. Teachers, parents, a few students. They asked about his music, where he learned, what came next. He answered as best he could, still uncomfortable with too much attention. But one moment stayed with him most. A small boy, maybe 9, skinny with crooked glasses, walked up and whispered, "That made me want to try piano too." Elijah knelt slightly. "You should." "I don't know how." "It doesn't matter. Just start." The boy smiled. That was enough. Later, as they drove home, Charlene was quiet. "You okay?" Elijah asked. She nodded. "I just never thought I'd see something like that, not with your name on it." He looked out the window. The streetlights blurred past. "Neither did I," he said, "but maybe it was always there." She didn't answer, but her hand reached across the console and rested on his. That night, Elijah sat at home with a notebook in his lap. He wasn't writing music, just words, scattered thoughts, a line he wanted to remember. You don't have to be invited to be allowed. The world hadn't given him permission to sit at that piano. He'd taken it, gently, honestly, fully. And in doing so, he'd reminded them and himself that talent doesn't care where you're from, what you wear, or how much your parents donated. It only cares that you listen when it calls. So if you're watching this and wondering whether you're good enough, whether you're allowed to try, here's your sign. You are. Now go do it.